what the leader of the opposition in the National Assembly said at the end uh, after Bikram's intervention, that we need to create some kind of project for economic sovereignty and economic development. Uh, they took it very seriously, and before leaving said, if you guys want to create a good group that helps us develop that plan, we would be happy to present it on the floor of the parliament, which means it can become part of the national debate, national discussion. And that's one thing you would have noticed, that there is this a certain lack of ideas circulating in the public sphere at the moment in Pakistan because of the heightened kind of political antagonism. So we have a chance of creating certain ideas that can reach the mainstream. And this is what Zaman and Raja Sahib as well told me before leaving, the General Secretary of the PPI, that he would be he's coming tomorrow, he says, uh, to the conference, and he wants to kind of stay in touch. But I also wanted us to kind of have a slightly different perspective on the broader, because that perspective was very much of engaged political activists and politicians. But today we want to kind of discuss the imperatives of the Pakistani state as well. Not mimicking what the state is thinking, but trying to understand the genuine security concerns vis-a-vis Iran, vis-a-vis the US, China. How is it that the Pakistani state has been thinking? The good, the bad, and the bizarre, all of it we're going to try to understand today. And one of the things that we wanted to kind of, the impressions we wanted to dispel is that, any neat kind of a binary for Pakistan as just like another new colony of the US. People have been trying very hard to make that argument in the global public sphere that it's slightly more complicated than that. And the Iran kind of negotiations, mediation, threw a lot of commentators off globally because there was no frame to understand that Pakistan exercises some autonomy in international affairs. So we have with us one of the foremost analysts, security political analysts of Pakistan, who that we've been learning from him for the last 17, 18 years. He, I believe, is also an ex-military officer and has also regularly given talks and lectures to officers in the Pakistan military. And his viewpoint, at times very critical of the military, but is taken very seriously by the military leadership. He's one of those thinkers who can kind of look at both sides of the divide and is taken seriously by the opposition as well as those who are running the country. And so we're very, very glad to have you, Ejaz Haider, with us. We also have with us Rabia Mehmood. You all have already met her. And Rabia is a journalist. She's also worked for Amnesty International. And I think, apart from the very good work she's done for human rights in Pakistan, I think it's very interesting to see her trajectory, which kind of reflects the new consciousness that's emerging around nationalism and the state, which kind of aligns with where some of the Marxist groups are also going, particularly like our group is very much in the vanguard of it, on why the question of the state became so important for people who were always critical and at a distance from the state, and how kind of Gaza played a very important role, and India-Pakistan event played a very important role. And then we have, of course, our host, Huma, Zaman.
We have Senator Ali Zafar.
I will introduce him
when he comes
in. Yeah, and she is an advocate, a lawyer, and she's a host of a YouTube show as well, and she has been supporting a lot of human rights activists and political activists whose rights were violated. She's done a number of constitutional petitions as well. And yeah, so thank you
gender rights.
on gender rights as well. So she's been very active on that front, and she's taken this initiative. Okay. So yeah, are you talking to that? So and then the final speaker will be Barrister Ali Zafar, who's a senator. He's on his way. He's a senator with the opposition, and
he's the leader of the opposition in the Senate.
And he will be giving his perspective as well. And he has a very interesting perspective on the state of affairs. He is in the opposition, but on the question of sovereignty, he has a very complex and interesting question. So we can start with.
Can I just introduce the forum that
Please
we are hosting? Because I think we've just started with Ammar. We started this forum, which is called Thought and Action Forum. In Urdu, we call it Fikru Amal, but it's basically Thought and Action Forum. Our motto and our slogan is think deeply, act justly. So we believe that Pakistan is Pakistan-focused, forward-looking think tank committed to fostering inclusive dialogue, intellectual engagement, and practical solutions for the nation's most pressing challenges. It's rooted in the principles of diversity, equity, and progress. The forum serves as a platform that brings together voices from all walks of life, academia, policy, civil society, religious research, media, and grassroots communities. Our mission is to cultivate a space where diverse political perspectives, social viewpoints, and ideological frameworks can converge in a spirit of mutual respect and constructive engagement. By encouraging meaningful dialogue across differences, we aim to reduce polarization and bridge social divides that hinder national cohesion and progress. Fikru Amal, Thought and Action Forum, seeks not only to generate ideas, but to translate thought into action. We are dedicated to developing a progressive, actionable narrative for Pakistan, one that is grounded in the country's rich cultural heritage, informed by its religious and ethical traditions, and aligned with contemporary global standards of justice, human dignity, and good governance. Through research, dialogue, policy recommendations, and community engagement, this forum aspires to contribute to the creation of a just, balanced, and equitable society. We believe that sustainable progress can only be achieved by harmonizing tradition with modernity and by empowering citizens to participate actively in shaping a more inclusive and compassionate future for Pakistan. So welcome all of you, and I give the floor to Mr. Ejaz.
Thank you. Welcome to everyone, but especially given the situation to our scholar guest from Tehran. More power to your elbow, as they say. And thank you also to Ammar, not only for inviting me, but also a very generous introduction. I just hope that, I can fulfill what, what you said about me. Let me just say that I'm using the state as a unit of analysis. Well, obviously one can raise the question of whether that is the only unit of analysis, but that's a separate question altogether. Also, I'm going to restrict my domain by focusing on the security aspects. There is much more to Pakistan than just that. And as you continue to meet with people, you will come across multiple and, varied points of view. I must also say that lots of points of view here in Lahore will be very different from the ones that you probably get in Karachi or in Balochistan or in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. So, what I'm going to say is just a sliver of what Pakistan is. So one of the questions that I want to address is the issue of how Pakistan has looked at its security. One of the primary concerns has been India, and it started with 47, 48 with the Kashmir war. I have a bit of a personal stake in that because I belong to Azad Kashmir, and I lost 5 members of my extended family in the rebellion, the Punch rebellion against the Dogra Raja. My father was also one of the founding members of what was then known as the Azad Kashmir Regular Forces, which ultimately post 71 became the AK Regiment of the Pakistan Infantry. So there's a bit of that oral history that informs my view of that, but I'm not going to go into the details of that. So essentially, the 47-48 Kashmir War.
So
Acha,
because
oh.
we're being recorded.
And also the issue of waters. Lots of people don't realize that in the early 50s, there was this problem, and a couple of times India stopped the waters, and then, it's one of those ironies that it was a military dictator who actually worked out the famous, or now shall I say, since the BJP government's advent to power, the infamous Indus Waters Treaty was signed, and until recently it held, despite all the tensions and wars and everything. So this rivalry also defined Pakistan's refusal to sign the nuclear non-proliferation treaty. And it basically took cover behind India because, and I'm not going to talk about India because we have a scholar here from India, as an Indian American who knows about India much more than I do. But this is the time when India is supposed to be, under Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru, the sort of, cosmopolitan leadership role, non-aligned movement and the rest of it, staying away from the Cold War, the sort of bounded universe of Cold War. Whether in practical terms that was actually happening is another story. But the fact is that India took this position that this is a discriminatory treaty, and if you want to have this, then everyone should disarm. We took the position that we have a security concern with India, and if India is not going to sign the NPT, we are not going to sign the NPT. Mind you, and this also dovetails with this question of how close Pakistan has been to the United States, or whether Pakistan has been a sort of handmaiden of the United States. And my assertion here is that it has never been the case. And those are the points that I want to discuss. So NPT is one. China is another. And this is much before 1970s, when the Americans realized that there was a split between the Soviet Union, then Soviet Union and China. And therefore, perhaps they could capitalize on that. And just like today, frankly, when everyone is asking this question of how come Pakistan is the mediator here, Pakistan was the mediator then. And this was at the height of the Cold War. And we could balance our relations with the United States with our relations with China. 65. We were part of Seato and CENTO. We were part of that so-called cordon sanitaire against communism. But we were getting all this stuff because we were actually going to fight India, not the Soviet Union, not the communists. And so the Americans were taken aback, and they stopped the supply of weapons to Pakistan. And we said, well, we have this kind of friend who stops the supply of weapons at the time when we need them the most. So much before this transactional orangutan who's now in the White House, we also understood the idea of transactional relations with the United States. Then comes the China thing. And once again, we are in the driver's seat. But after that, we decided, because we realized that India was moving towards acquiring the nuclear weapons capability. So in 1972, there was a conference convened, a secret conference convened in Multipolar, which is about 350 kilometers south of where we are, by Zulfikar Ali Bhutto. And he decided that Pakistan is going to pursue the nuclear weapons capability. And so we started working on that. And in 74, India tested, which it called the peaceful test, whatever that means. And so we obviously fast-paced our program. And Zulfikar Ali Bhutto wanted the reprocessing plant because we wanted to go for the plutonium route. And the Americans threw a spanner in the works. And they told the French that, sorry, but you can't give this reprocessing plant to Pakistan. So that is how we took the uranium route. And we started working on that. And then, of course, two other things happened: the Iranian Revolution and also the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. Now, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, if I just pull back a little, before that, when Sardar Dawood took over, there were lots of arrests of various people and various leaders from the Kabul University also. A number of later Mujahideen actually came to Peshawar. This was Ahmad Shah Massood, Abdul Rab Rasool Sayaf, Ustad Rabbani, Hikmat Yar, and others. They were given a stipend from the acquittance rolls of the Frontier Corps. The Frontier Corps Inspector General at that time used to be a brigadier level officer, and this was the famous Nasirullah Babar, who ultimately became the Major General and then joined PPP, was also the Interior Minister of Pakistan. Nasirullah Babar wrote a position paper and gave it to Mr. Bhutto. Now, we obviously, as some of you might know, had been facing this Afghan irredentism from the get-go. It was the only country that cast a negative vote in September 1947 against Pakistan, although they reversed it in October, but so there were all this ups and downs and the rest of it. And so for once, we thought that we had the opportunity to actually put the heat on Afghanistan rather than the other way around. And it wasn't much. A few hundred Lee Enfield 303 rifles and some money and the rest of it, but nothing much. But something else was happening in Afghanistan external to what we were doing. And that was a realization by Sardar Dawood that there was a lot of infiltration of the Soviet Union in his military and in his intelligence services and the rest of it. So he slowly and gradually started purging officers from the military and started moving closer to Saudi Arabia, the United States, Iran, Pakistan. Something that obviously the Soviets didn't like much. In fact, he had a meeting with Mr. Bhutto, and the note taker was the late former Foreign Secretary of Pakistan, Ejaz Haider. When I interviewed him, he gave me some idea of what went on. And there was an understanding that Afghanistan will officially recognize the border, which they call the Durand Line. But before that could happen, Mr. Bhutto was ousted in a coup. But interestingly enough, Ziaul Haq, who had ousted Bhutto, took the baton on this one. And Sardar Dawood again visited Pakistan, and it was arranged that he will go back and he'll work on this, and this is what's going to happen. So he went back, And there were lots of these leaders of the ANP, like Ajmal Khattak, late Ajmal Khattak and others who were in Kabul. And he declared to them, he said, listen, you guys got to go back because we want to open a new chapter with Pakistan. A lot of this is also, among other works, has been noted in that book by Diego Cardovez and Selig Harrison, Out of Afghanistan. And I also spoke about it those years ago when Mr. Khattak was still alive and some other ANP leaders who were present in that meeting where Sardar Dawood present. But trouble was brewing for him there with the assassination of Mir Akbar, if I got the name right. And then, of course, the coup and the killing of Sardar Dawood along with his family and the rest of it. And then, of course, we know that they could not control Afghanistan and the Soviets walked in. But even as the Soviets were walking in, Brezhnev was sending messages to the United States saying, listen, we do not want any adventurism. We just want to consolidate the government in Afghanistan. So there was a debate going on in the United States between Cyrus Vance and Brzezinski. Brzezinski, the former sort of Polish American who hated the Soviets and wanted to make Afghanistan the Soviet Vietnam, and Cyrus Vance, who was looking at it more objectively, saying, oh no, if you look at the force levels and the rest of it, they're not going anywhere. They're not going to cut through Pakistani Balochistan or get to the warm waters. And anyway, to cut a long story short, Vance lost that debate and the US got into that fight. And we got into that fight. And we got into that fight primarily because it allowed us the space to increase our military capabilities, including working on our nuclear weapons capability, which is exactly what we did. And to essentially circumvent the Glenn Symington Amendment, we got a Pakistan-specific Pressler Amendment, which would allow the President of the United States, bypassing the Congress, to simply certify that Pakistan was not working towards developing a nuclear weapon capability. And that was the end of it, and support would come in. And then, of course, we developed the capability, and while we were developing this capability, there was this exercise Brass Tacks in 86, 87, which was conducted by General Sundarji. It was an army-level exercise. One of the best analytical works on that exercise has been done by the late Steve Cohn, the late P.R. Chari, and the late Parvez Iqbal Chima. 4 Crises and a Moral for Peace or something, if I remember the title correctly. Primarily miscommunication, misperception, which is why India and Pakistan, by the way, after that, began working on certain hotlines to make sure that there's not going to be further, in case of a crisis, there's not going to be a misperception. But the interesting part of that was that Mushahid Hussain Sayyid, former senator, who was then, I think he was still the editor of the Muslim, if I remember correctly, arranged for the late Mr. Kuldeep Nayyar to interview A.Q. Khan, Abdul Qadir Khan.
They won't know who these people are.
Okay. So A.Q. Khan is the guy who's said to be the father of Pakistani bomb, which is a huge exaggeration because nuclear capability is not the function of a single person's effort. It requires a lot of effort by nuclear physicists, metallurgists, supply chain experts, and so on and so forth. So it was a teamwork over a long period of time. Mushahid Hussain Sayyid is a very famous journalist. He's also been a minister a couple of times, was a senator. I don't know if he's still a senator. And he was then the editor of a newspaper called The Muslim, which was a very prestigious newspaper. The late Mr. Kuldeep Nayyar, again, was a very famous Indian journalist. quite another thing that another Indian journalist, just to lighten the mood, another Indian journalist, Dilip Pandgankar, once in Srinagar said to me that about Mr. Nayyar, that someone said to him that, we know that you started with the Hindi journalism, but why do you have to prove that by writing in English? So, so this was Mr. Pandgankar's sort of, sly remark about it. Anyway, so the idea was for A.Q. Khan to signal to the Indians that we have the bomb. It's quite another thing that the crisis had dissipated by the time this interview came out. The Americans had sent, their own emissary. They were involved in trying to broker the crisis and the rest of it. They were also quite cut up with Pakistan. This signal also went to the Americans. So the next president, the elder Bush, told us a year before, they were to stop certifying that he will not certify, because by then they knew that we were at an advanced level of weapons development. So that whole thing sort of came apart. There was no certification and we were under sanctions. But by then we were so advanced that, we could do stuff on our own despite sanctions. And it's a long story about shell companies and, a network of shell companies and how this was worked. Iran has also been doing that. There's a very interesting book by an Iranian academic who just came out, Sina Azodi, on the Iranian, nuclear ambitions. So, so we fast forward to the idea of US-Pakistan relations that had hit rock bottom. And then, of course, 9/11 happens. And 9/11, once again, what I call the tyranny of geography. Once again, we are needed by the United States. But interestingly enough, just to add one thing, considering that what's happening between the US, the Zionist entity, and Iran, during the Bonn process, after the Taliban had been ousted, Pakistan was not at the table. Iran was. And Jawad Zarif, who was then the deputy foreign minister, was actively involved in the negotiations. He and the US envoy on Afghanistan, James Dobbins, used to have morning coffee every day. Dobbins has actually written about this. They hit it off very nicely. Iran actually offered the United States help with stabilizing Afghanistan. But then the younger Bush went and made that axis of evil speech, which pushed Iran back. In 2003, Iran again came up with what they described as the grand bargain. It's the closest that they have come to basically as a quid pro quo, that the Zionist entity agrees to a two-state solution and Iran will rethink its regional alliances and also its relations with the United States and the Zionist entity. It was flatly rejected by the Americans. We all know that during the Iran-Iraq war, because the Zionists thought that Iraq was a bigger threat, they were supplying those weapons to Iran, and we all know that Iran-Contra scandal and all that. And so the point is that and this is not peculiar to Pakistan. Relations between Iran and the United States and the Zionist entity have been very complex. US-Pakistan relations have also been very complex. They've mostly been transactional. And we said, okay, you can have this guy. And that's how it started. This whole thing with Trump started with that Abbey Gate thing. And then when he gave the State of Union address, he described Pakistan as this, fantastic country that is with which we have this great counterterrorism thing. And, we captured the mastermind of the Abbey Gate. But I think where it became kind of further entrenched, if you will, was the major miscalculation by India last May. And on this, I want to dwell for like 2 minutes, because I don't want to turn this into a monologue with destiny. The Indian assumption, and we can have Q&A on that. The Indian assumption has been that conventionally India is superior to Pakistan. India will start the first round, give Pakistan a bloody nose, make it very difficult for Pakistan to retaliate. And even if Pakistan retaliates, India will again win the second round, and forcing Pakistan to escalate. And the only way Pakistan can escalate is by rattling the nuclear saber. And that is the time when the entire world pressure will be on Pakistan, and Pakistan will have to back off. So this is essentially, in a nutshell, this has been the Indian thinking. Unfortunately for India, both in 2019 and in 2025, these basic assumptions fell apart. And that is where Trump realized that we've been supporting India as the net security provider. We have changed the nomenclature of Asia Pacific to Indo Pacific. And if they cannot handle Pakistan, how in Darwin's name are they going to handle China? If at all. And then, of course, the fact that he invited Asim Munir to come and have lunch with him, quite unprecedented. And then he made a phone call to Mr. Modi, and he wanted Mr. Modi to make a pit stop. And Mr. Modi realized that he would very likely put him in proximity of Asim Munir, which will be political suicide for Mr. Modi. And he said, thanks, but no thanks. Not realizing that this is going to really rile up Trump. Now, please remember that I'm not talking about any structural changes in the relationship between the United States and Pakistan, or the United States and India. There are Indo-US relations, structurally speaking, are far more strong than anything that the US has with Pakistan. But given the current scenario, and given the transactional nature, and given the kind of personality that occupies the Oval Office at this time, Pakistan has got a leg up on India. And finally, on this issue of mediation, and I know I recently used the middle power framework for this, but quickly, not just in the Islamic bloc, but also in the entire world, Pakistan is the only state right now, and I make this statement with great responsibility, that is on speaking terms with all the actors involved. I'm not talking about the Zionist entity. We don't recognize them. We don't even, as far as we are concerned, this is that territorial space is called occupied Palestine. But the United States, Pakistan can speak with the United States. Pakistan can speak with Riyadh. Pakistan can speak with Tehran. Pakistan can speak with Beijing. And that is what has structurally allowed Pakistan to be where it is in terms of its mediation.
So let me introduce once again Barrister Ali Zafar, who is not only one of the top lawyers in the country, he is also a senator and leader of his party, the PTI, in the Senate. So we would like to know more about the kind of solidarity that Pakistan was able to give to Iran. For example, your speech went viral. I believe the Senate and the National Assembly also passed resolutions for Khamenei. What is the thinking amongst the political leadership of the country in terms of the question of Pakistan's sovereignty as well as the changing regional dynamics? And we'll have 10 minutes and 10 minutes and then we'll open it.
Thank you very much. My name is Ali Zafar. I'm a senator in the Senate of Pakistan, almost for the last 4 years. I'm also part of the chairperson of the Information Ministry and the Law Committee, and also very much part of the Foreign Committee of the Senate. So I have some inside information which I won't be able to share to an extent, but we look at the global picture first. Very briefly, I think we've gone through the historic part of Pakistan and very well elaborated. I won't touch that, but very briefly, Pakistan, since its inception in 1947, we had no constitution. We were governed by what they called the Independence Act of 1947. And that said that the interim constitution of Pakistan will be the 1935 Act, which the British India was, when they were ruling, this was the constitution of the subcontinent. So we inherited in 1947 a colonial legal order or legal framework. And that effectively created 2 or 3 very important legal and practical problems for us. First, because of this constitution, the control of the government was with the bureaucracy. So it was executive controlled rather than parliament controlled. Number 2, we had only 2 major institutions at that time. There was an excellent civil service inherited from the British, and there was an excellent organized institution of the armed forces, which we inherited. The rest of it was just these very big landlords who sat together and said, let's make a constitution. 10 years passed. 10 years passed. And I call that the original sin of the parliament. They had a constituent assembly. Quaid-e-Azam died, Jinnah, the founder of Pakistan, died in the first year. His very trusted lieutenant, Liaquat Ali Khan, was assassinated 2-3 years later. And then for 10 years, the politicians were just squabbling. They could not come up with a constitution. And then a third party entered the arena, which were the courts. They joined hands with the armed forces, with the bureaucracy, and they said, let's abrogate this entire system and make a new constitution. And the bureaucracy made a constitution of 1956. That was the first constitution. And they created 2 problems in it. One problem was that, if you remember at that time, Pakistan was in 2 parts, East Pakistan and West Pakistan, 1,000 miles apart. They said that we will not have 1 vote for 1 person. We will have a parity of votes, which means that we'll have a National Assembly with equal seats. Bangladesh, which was much bigger in majority, and a smaller West Pakistan would also have equal number of seats. So the Bangladeshis now, the East Pakistanis then, they said that means you are not treating us equal to West Pakistanis. And that started creating a problem. 2 years later, this 1956 constitution was abrogated and Ayub Khan walked in. The army, which already had a role in the government before, actually took over. And in Dosa case, the Supreme Court, the Federal Court then said, perfect, please come in, you are a revolution, we recognize you as the new legal order. Since then, actually a army state, army controlled state, one way or the other. Yes, for a little while we had Bhutto after Ayub Khan. There was a 1965 war which has just been mentioned. That war created a problem for Ayub Khan, and as a result in 69 he had to go, but then Yahya came into the picture, General Yahya Khan, and then Bhutto for a short time, but then Ziaul Haq came, again the army controlled. After Ziaul Haq was killed in a plane crash, we then had for a very short time 4 governments, each of them 2 years or 2.5 years long. Benazir Bhutto, Oxford educated, excellent person, but only lasted 2 years, was removed. Nawaz Sharif came, 2 years, removed. Benazir came again, 2 years, removed. Nawaz Sharif came again, 2 years, and then we had Musharraf Ali. We then had a civilian government. Armed forces decided something new. Ultimately they said, look, we can't in this age keep imposing martial laws because the world is not accepting them. So what do they come up with? I think brilliant move. As a lawyer I can tell you, and I can take you through the things they've done since then. They made a hybrid regime. They said, let's have a civilian face, but let's keep the control to ourselves. The only problem that they had in this was the courts, because the courts were still, flexing their muscles, and they were talking about fundamental rights, they were talking about human rights, rule of law, and they were not going to accept all this. So what do? They make the 26th Amendment. They divided the court first. So with the division came the division of the judiciary and the division of the lawyers. And then they waited for a little while we were still trying to come to terms with the 26th Amendment. They made the 27th Amendment, and they totally bifurcated the courts. They took away the system, the constitutional fundamental right jurisdiction of the Supreme Court, and gave it to the Constitutional Court. So now the Supreme Court can only deal with cases which are of individual nature, family matters, rent matters, criminal law, murder, theft. But the constitutional matters are all dealt with by the Constitutional Court. Who controls the appointment? The person who controls the appointment controls the court itself. If I know I like you and I want to appoint you, and I like you, I want to appoint you, so I'll get both of you on my court. And then tomorrow when I'm in a problem, I'll come to you and say, you are my friends, decide in my favor. So appointment process was very much important to be controlled. Through the 27th Amendment, they controlled that. So this is the overall scenario where we have in a position where there is the armed forces. Now let's look around us. We have Saudi Arabia. We have the Arab states. Who do they want to deal with? Do they want to deal with a parliament? Or do they want to deal with one person whose command is final? If you look at the history, and I've talked to a lot of people from that part of the world, they say, we believe in talking to one person. We don't care about we come to your prime ministers and they say, I'll have to go to my cabinet. We go to the cabinet, they say we have to talk to the parliament, which is 400 different people with different ideas. We want to talk to one man, and that's your armed forces. So they are very much diplomatically comfortable with the present hybrid system. We look at USA. I think a very clear picture was presented. Since the very beginning, they've been more comfortable with, again, a one-man show.
And yes, nobody is anybody's friend. Everybody wants to be the master of somebody else. But every country is sovereign, and if you look at our history, we've had our ups and downs, but we have survived a sort of a friendship and a semi-comfortable state. Every time USA has needed us, we have been there, and so they are comfortable right now, they need us. Trump needs to get out of this war, so he needs us, and so we are there in this position. Iran, historically, we've been very much part of the Iranian system. We've had a bad blood with them for some time. We've even had some skirmishes on the border with them. They've been a little bit pro-India for quite some time. But as pointed out, recently they've realized that India is not really a friend for them in the way that Pakistan can. And their relationship with us is much more important. China has always been very, very friendly. We've had commercial ups and downs with them, but never ever has the ironclad friendship been shaken. CPAC, they've had issues with us, not going far enough. We've had issues with them, but that's part of commercial deals. It's never been that they've always been very, very close to them. So in this situation, we were going to be, it was very natural that we would fall into this mediation role. As rightly pointed out, everybody liked us. But I have one more problem to add to this. And that's a very serious problem that I've been narrating again, time and again, over and over. And I'd like to put that before this honorable forum as well. I believe that United Nations was created for a purpose. It was created to bring peace to this world. I genuinely believe that. And I believe that 5 nations were given veto powers because it was hoped, or expected at least, that these 5 nations would use their power to ensure that the rule of international law operated. But we had 2 major problems with this United Nations as it went forward. One was that we had this Cold War with USA and USSR at that time, and so they kept vetoing each other, and so the United Nations started becoming more like a rather than a problem solver, it became more like a body which was debating, but still it was effective. Recently, we realized, and we've seen that happening starting with the Zionist state, Israel, that has been killing people without care in the world, and the United Nations keeping quiet. That made me realize, and I think everybody else should realize, that United Nations has become now useless. I talk about the Western countries. We used to have a lot of delegations. They used to come and tell us, make this law. This is very important for human rights. Make that law. It is very important for human rights. But that was all what I call a bhashan. What's the right word in English for bhashan?
Yeah, fake lecture.
Sermon.
Like a sermon, like a fake sermon, a bhashan. Because if it was really a question, if they really felt that there was human rights and that had to be enforced, then the first person they should have enforced it against was this Zionist regime of Israel. And then we have Trump coming in and picking up a Venezuelan president, picking him up and his wife and saying, this is my right. And United Nations just looking like this and debating. So with this new world order, and there's so many examples of this, with United Nations gone, what is left? What is left is might is right. And my learned friend just mentioned how we are now a nuclear state. The other aspect that you must realize in all this, and it was with great difficulty that we, in spite of the entire world trying to stop us, we managed to make this nuclear bomb as a deterrent. Not as a aggression, as a deterrent. We have that, and that has resulted, in fact, in a certain might which is saving us in this world which has no international law, which has no rule of law, where United Nations is nothing. So with this factor in mind, it is where might is right, where United Nations is unimportant. My point is that we have to, as a Pakistani, as Pakistan as a country, we have to go for regional framework, regional security framework. And I see Turkey, I see Saudi Arabia, I even see Iran, I see Indonesia, Malaysia, I see all these parts, all these, China most important, even Russia, as part of the regional security framework. United Nations is irrelevant now. Might is right is the answer. And we need to make that. This mediation that is going on is part of that. It is part of a larger picture. One thing I just want to add last. I know I have 10 minutes. I was at a conference 15 years ago. 15 years ago, I was standing there with somebody, and this was a conference on economics. And I didn't know much about economics. I thought it was a law conference, but I ended up there because the government sent me. And everybody was talking, the finance ministers of various countries were talking about finance and how they did. So the Indonesian foreign minister, economic minister said, this is what we have done with our economy. The Singaporean said something. The European said, old economy, but we are now doing this and that. And so it came the time for Pakistan, and I had nothing to say because our economy was not doing well at that time. But I said, we've got one thing that perhaps will be very, very useful 10 or 15 years from now. And I just said it off the cuff. I didn't know that I was probably speaking the truth at that time or predicting something. I said, we have one thing we've invested in quite a lot since 1947. And so everybody said, what is it? They asked me a question, what is it that you've done in Pakistan that's so important? I said, we've invested in our security operators. And tomorrow when the United Nations will be irrelevant and might will be right, it will be the security that will make the economies flourish. So I believe that Pakistan is in a very, very good position right now, geographically, internationally, and also with this security environment important for the other countries. So we will see a positive change. The problem is that with the international situation as it is, if we don't rectify our internal situation, it will be useless what we do internationally. So the fact that it is a good thing that we are right now a nuclear power, the fact that it's a good thing that we've managed to beat India, it's a good thing that India can't win from us conventionally also. The fact that we're making our own planes, the fact that we've got a very organized military apparatus, these are all very important for that might is right international world. But you need the people behind you. And if you can't get the people behind you, if you can't have a thriving, debating, good political environment, ultimately you will not be able to do much internationally as well. So that is where I see the problem. I've given you what I feel, very frankly, the positives. I think the government has done great. I'm an opposition member, but I think in the mediation business, we have done excellent. We have utilized the good things that we had. Internally, we need to solve a lot of things. Thank you.
Thank you. This is very helpful, Senator Saab, and because the Honourable Senator is part of the Foreign Relations Committee as well. So you can see that this is very much thinking that's now burgeoning within the state apparatus, which is the thinking of regional security. And when we open the discussion, I think we'll have some good ideas about how internal economic change can complement the opportunities that are rising in the international area. So thank you so much. Rabia, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Ammar. We, as people have been talking about, our seniors have been talking about nukes and security and nationalism. And as Pakistanis, we just kind of for the past 20-25 years cope with everything through jokes online. That's been our thing. And not to undermine what's happening in the world, but we've been saying this for the past 3 years, since October, that especially people from my generation, because it was never a thing we thought about. We were just too busy, challenging the state or security establishment with everything. That was our default position on all the work that we did. So we've been saying that, thank God we have nukes, right? Without even realizing. I mean, this has become such a thing for my generation. It's it's not something we ever thought about, right? And then even in our WhatsApp groups, it took us a bit of time to come to this point that we could say it out loud, right? And so I say this with a lot of love and respect. We've always said that, Ejaz Haider is a hawk, and now we're all mini hawks. So with Ammar and Tabby and everyone, I call our group the new nationalists. And I say this in a self-deprecating way. So yes, I used to for a few years, work with Amnesty International in Sri Lanka as a South Asian researcher, and I work with a lot of international NGOs, and most of my work has been documenting enforced disappearances and extrajudicial killings and torture by security establishment and blasphemy violence, state violence I called it, and I'm very proud of the work and I stand behind, but I feel like I can't talk about what I'm saying and what Gaza did to us without talking about war on terror, because I'm that generation that came of age right after 9/11 and much older than most people, or most of our friends, and then became a journalist during General Musharraf's emergency around 2006-2007. And just when I became a television journalist, I was a television journalist, Pakistani television was expanding, and I basically learned reporting on the job while reporting on bomb blasts in Lahore, right? From the front lines. And I'm mentioning this because whatever's happened to us now is also because of all that we went through when we were hyphenated as part of AFPAC. Pakistan has had tens and thousands of people who've been slaughtered in suicide bombings and terrorist attacks over the years for some reason, and still we are the only villain in that story. We have failed to tell our story. I feel like we've failed, but we're still living it. And for some reason there is no acknowledgement of it, and we have never really thought of ourselves as victims, if not perpetrators. And and it feels like for the world, the slaughter of our children, of our soldiers, and even for a while we also forgot it, just doesn't really matter, and I see that I'm not part of any organized left group, but I see that even in the analysis of from the Western world, and some really notable people who comment on Pakistan, and somehow it's just it's a lapdog state, and there's no acknowledgement of what's happened. And I've seen that, I was at MIT for a fellowship around 2010 and 11, and they picked me up because I was reporting on bomb blast, right? But I went there, and somehow across Howard in that space, and when I was interning in New York with New York Times, right when Osama was found here, and like there was no interest in the fact that I'm someone with me and so many of my colleagues have PTSD after witnessing bomb blasts and seeing dead bodies all around us, like in mosques and outside police stations and everywhere. And we learned to also deal with it because back home there were so many problems, right? So we learned to like focus inwards. There were so many problems. My generation was just focusing. We went through lawyers' movement together, and that's how we're also friends. And then we were just focusing inwards, and there was a lot of instability, a lot of issues at home. Then I worked with the alternative media space to circumvent censorship of the time around 2016-17. Went and worked with MIT, came back, still kept on doing that work, and then Gaza happened, and all of that trauma of war on terror times, as a citizens of the global south, as someone who's from a Muslim majority country, just came to the surface, right? And I feel like it still lives in our bodies, and now with Iran and Lebanon, and we've been living through it. And I'm not making it about Pakistan, but it is also about us, right? Because we've also been through so much. And yeah, that's where it comes from. Then in 2024, I mean, of course, we know what happened to Libya and Iraq all those years. And 2024, with the fall of Damascus and Al-Qaeda taking over and being normalized in Syria. And then there was this like conversation which started. There's another one of a very senior journalist and Ejaz's former editor, Najm Sethi, who said like, Pakistan and Iran. It's going to be Pakistan and Iran, right? It's 2024, December. And I was like, okay, fine, that's going to happen. And then in May, it was Pakistan's turn. And, then it happened and we saw the barrage of hate coming from that side towards us. Like they wanted to Gazify us, the Gazification of Pakistan, right? And we were never really ready for, frankly, even in that space and, having worked with Indian colleagues on documenting what was happening to Muslims and minorities there, because I worked on a lot on minorities here, and still was not ready for the scale of hatred which was coming from that side, right? And then it also, in the context, made you realize how unsafe we were, and this institution that we were very much critical of, we had to rethink that. Our own relationship with our state, our own relationship with the security establishment. And I say this like, we were like looking at another case of arbitrary detention of an activist even today, earlier in Islamist. So very cognizant of what happens, but at the same time, very, very aware of how vulnerable we are. And that's how it has been for us. And and now we're all mini hawks now in 2020. And so, am I mind several?
Well, thank you so much. Okay, so we'll open the floor for comments, and Hamista Kate will take comments, and then we'll come back for conclusions.
First of all, I just wanted to thank all the speakers. You've given us such a wonderful and deep perspective on what's going on here. I'm really more understanding Pakistan in this much less than 1 hour than I have for a long time. So it's really great. I don't want to, no questions really. I agree with what you say. It's a really important understanding. I guess maybe I'll just throw out one question, which seems to arise just out of my curiosity. When the party, you have said, between what I have heard, that the Pakistani state is kind of a state within a state that belongs to the army. That state has made all the decisions up to now, more or less all the important decisions, and that they have, of course, developed nuclear weapons. I totally understand the rationale for developing nuclear weapons. I would say, so I have no difficulty with that. But when you say today that we are glad that we have nuclear weapons, we have all become more silent, and I again totally understand. But how does given how the army relates to the neighborhood, which is not very well at all, how do you see, in what sense are the nuclear weapons of all Pakistanis? Do you see what I mean?
all say that objective when you say I'm trying to what it means today. When the Pakistani state acts, if it ever does, with nuclear weapons, will it be acting in the interest of Pakistanis? And of course, and being from India, I will just add one other thing. In the long-term perspective that you gave, I was talking with Amal yesterday, and I'll just share that thought with you. I think, partition is a very big goal in South Asia. I'm not saying that we have reversed it or anything, but given that it's a deep goal, the states, the successor states have to work with that and work to address that. And I would say that the reason for that move is not cheaper. It's not some kind of delegitimating the Muslims. We all know that. Every time Indians and Pakistanis get together, they shed tears, I'm sure, after a few days about what's going on and what has happened. But it's because of Brahmanism. Brahmanism, which is today mutated into Hinduism in India, and that is the enemy of all South Asians. So I just wanted to throw that in, because
Thank you, Dr. Rabia Desai is at the London School of Economics and a political economist. And you can maybe write down the questions and we'll come back for your final. He's also very introduce yourself.
Sunday University and that's fantastic. So there is no. I was thinking that on the same lines that the intensity between China and the intensity of the contradiction between China and the United States, speaking the obvious, right, is going to intensify. And as this intensifies, the contradictions everywhere are going to flare up as well, including here. And we're going to see, that when push comes to shove, we're going to see the local financial class, which is governing the place, which has basically lives off the rents that it accrues, the geostrategic rents, make sure that the service of the debt every month, external debt, which is about a third of Pakistan's GDP, that is, so the rents, which actually also shape the conditions, the state of consciousness that results in the poor developmental outcomes that we see. But at the same time, as I said, when the contradictions intensify, we're going to see the few people in the only institutions, they might have a vested interest in lodging themselves more closely to the United States camp, maybe, as a result of their financial deposits in the United States, their personal financial deposits in the United States. So there's a double whammy here. Right. There's first the rents that they make sure that the debt and the conditions of indebtedness ruin Pakistani society. And there's the other part, which is which is a huge conditionality, and it's called the short leash, the short financial leash. Everyone in the third world suffers from this condition. But there's the other part, is from what I hear, and I'm not sure I know enough about it, is that the rank and file of the army leadership, they have money invested in the United States, money deposited in the United States, so they're basically, as elements of a social class, they reproduce themselves through closeness to the United States. Now the question then becomes, when the conditions are heightened, the conditions and competitions are heightened, will Pakistan side with China or will it side with the United States?
That's a very good question. Thank you.
I think because these two questions, there's not exactly a contradiction of what the senator said, but just to add a bit of nuance to this, some of the very important security decisions in Pakistan were not taken by the army, but by the civilians. For instance, the decision to, or shall I say, the kind of instigation to go to war in 65 was not by the self-styled Field Marshal Ayub Khan. It was Mr. Bhutto who somehow convinced Ayub Khan. And just to add another technicality to that, Pakistan did not violate an international border. Pakistan crossed what was then the ceasefire line, which was established in 1949. That is one thing. Secondly, Pakistan's ingress was not into quote unquote what Pakistan recognized as India, but as a disputed territory, which the dispute hung there, and India had, basically tried to freeze it. So it was India which, after the Indian counter was stopped and the Pakistani counter to India went in, and we were at a striking distance of Jammu, that India opened along the international border. So that's one. And as a matter of fact, 1/3 of the army was on leave in Pakistan when this happened. So that's one thing. The decision to go the nuclear weapons route was once again taken by a civilian, not a military officer. It's quite another thing that one of the things, and I think one of the reasons we managed to basically get it done, was that regardless of who was in the driver's seat, this policy was so consistent that it went from A to A1, A1 to B, B to B1, C, regardless of who was ideologically, or whether the guy was in mufti or in uniform, did not matter. Similarly, the decision to somehow diplomatically bring Afghanistan to accept the Durand Line as an international border was again Mr. Zulfikar Ali Bhutto. Which is not to say that the army has not taken certain decisions. It has. But I'm just saying that the situation is more complicated than it's. One other thing about military dictatorships in Pakistan. No Latin American dictator or African dictator or Indonesian dictator would mount a coup and then go to a court to ask the court to legitimate it. It's only in Pakistan that the military dictator comes in and then wants to be legitimized. And I remember talking to Professor Sen in 2000 when he was Master of Trinity, and I was there for this Pugwash conference. And I said to him, this is because, using the title of your book, we are argumentative Indians. So there is something peculiar about the fact that the military wants to, because it also has an image of a national army. So it doesn't want to come across as an occupation army or as an oppressor army. That image has been dented many times. That's another thing. But I'm just saying that, we have to put it in the proper place. Nuclear weapons. I am happy that Rabia is, because I know that I was, I used to be surprised that I'm being called a hawk because I've never been a hawk. I'm also, I occupy a space between a deterrence optimist and a deterrence pessimist. And the reason I occupy that space is because if you look at deterrence, and if you apply the Karl Popper's principle of falsification, then it's not a scientific principle to begin with. It's a psychological thing. It's not a scientific thing. It works until it fails. And so if you begin to do a thought experiment, and if you run hundreds of computer simulations, a time will come that you will have a nuclear Armageddon. So I occupy that space in between. And the reason I occupy that space in between is because we are entering a wolf world that we just talked about. If we had not entered the wolf world, I would have wanted everyone to get rid of the nuclear weapons, because we are now introducing the artificial intelligence into the kill chain. And anyone who has watched that film Walking will realize that it is not just a fantasy thing. It is something which is real and it can happen. So I think people of Pakistan, it's not an army project, by the way. People of Pakistan, like people across the world, we look at the conversations happening in South Korea, the conversations happening in Japan, of all the places, the conversation happening in Germany. There's something about security. It's the same kind of thing which the French did when de Gaulle asked Nixon whether Nixon would actually sacrifice New York for Paris. And if the answer is no, then France needs to have its own nuclear weapons, especially after the humiliation in Suez. So I think it has to do more with that. Then, and final thing, in 2019, in 2025, the one thing that Pakistan proved, and which Pakistan is continuously working on, is to ensure that it shifts the onus of responsibility for escalation on India. Indian thinking has been that it will put the onus of escalation on Pakistan. Pakistan has reversed the logic of that. It said, we are going to conventionally going to have the kind of qualitative superiority over you, which, if you try to go for it, we will force you into escalating. And that's exactly what happened. And it has happened conventionally, but it can also happen, beyond the conventional thing. And escalation ladder is the 44 rungs. One of the biggest criticisms, I am one of the critics, escalation is not step by step. It can be exponential. And it doesn't have to be lateral. It can be, it doesn't have to be vertical. It can be lateral. So, there are a number of issues that one can discuss with reference to escalation. But the fact is that it's not a military project.
One question about China and US choosing between.
Yes, I'll just add, I'll do that, but if I can just add, with your permission, some of the points that you made.
GG.
I've also got something in common with you. I studied in London School of Economics.
I didn't study there, just a visiting professor
You're
there.
a professor, so something in common.
I might have, but I didn't.
Something in common. You spoke about partition. One of the things that we are facing after partition is of a serious nature. And you're right that partition was very, very traumatic for many families. They still are. I know a lot of people who visit each other's countries and then they cry and they hug, and we've got so many things in common. But you see, Quaid-e-Azam Muhammad Ali Jinnah gave the concept. He was a great advocate for united India. All he wanted was an ironclad guarantee that tomorrow the Hindu majority is not going to make the Muslim minority or crush the Muslim minority in a way that is against basic rights. That guarantee was not being given. And even the 1940 Lahore resolution, which was the first sort of official document towards Pakistan, that did not talk about really two different countries. It probably talked about or left the thing open for one common state, one common federation with different states which would be independent. But then the Congress party, they refused. They said, let the British go and we will make the constitution by whatever the majority wants. And that's when he changed his mind, that he realized, and I guess rightly so, because now we can see what was happening in your country, in India, what's happening with the Muslims there. But that was how it changed. And that theory, why I say the problem, it became a problem for Pakistan, I believe, is because that theory ended when Pakistan was born, as all theories end. Theories are not supposed to be, they're just theories. But unfortunately, some of us started believing that this two-nation concept was also post-Pakistan. Although Qaid-e-Azam, as soon as Pakistan was formed, he said, now you're free to go to your temples, to your mosques, to your churches, and that the two-nation theory is now finished. Now we are one country, one nation, one people, irrespective of caste, creed, religion. So that we are still facing that in our constitution. Every time the constitution comes and there's a discussion for an amendment, we keep going back to that same theme. Some people say that it's not a theory, this is how Pakistan was born. And some of us say, no, this is just a theory. We are now one nation. So that is something that I wanted to talk about when we spoke about partition. Nuclear. Nuclear is not the bomb is not a matter of one institution. It's not an army bomb. It's the people's bomb. A.Q. Khan, who was just mentioned, and he was my client. I spent a lot of time with him. When he came back from Holland, he actually was tried there. He was convicted in absentia in Holland because he was working in a nuclear facility there. And Bhutto had asked him to come back to Pakistan. So when he came back, they convicted him for spying. And my father at that time was a lawyer. He fought his case in Netherlands and won. So he was acquitted. And then when Musharraf came, if you remember, 9/11 happened. And we were under pressure. Musharraf was told by the US president or maybe their interior minister or finance minister that either you're with us or against us. And he said, I'm with you. So one of the things they wanted was A.Q. Khan to be brought to US or sent back to USA. And the government said, we're not going to allow you to do that, but we'll house arrest him in Pakistan itself. And they arrested him, and I then contested his case. So I used to go to his house all the time. And then I got the permission from the court for him to travel. So I traveled with him a few times, not a few times, many times. And, we'd land up in a railway station, or we would sit in a plane, and men and women would get up, kiss his hand, kiss his feet, kiss his forehead, and say, you've saved us. So nuclear deterrent or nuclear bomb for us is that we all can sleep soundly. So that's how.
So that still leaves the question, Professor Qadri's question, about choosing between the US and China, because this is a debate that's happening, considering that our economic system is so Pakistan we'll have a similar situation, or there's another way around. Or if we have to choose, what side should we be on, or would we be?
I've got my views on it, but I think Ejaz, you go ahead first, and then we will.
So okay. So let me pass this. Leaving aside the geostrategic events for a while, and simply talk about the US-China rivalry. One of the things, and this is my view as someone who puts bread on the table writing about these things. This particular rivalry is going to be different from what we had between the Soviet Union and the United States. Because these were two bounded blocks that didn't really interact in any meaningful way. But the supply chain complexities and interdependence is so much today that it's extremely difficult for both sides to completely sever off that connection. For instance, these much hyped interceptors, the PAC-3 interceptors and the THAAD interceptors, require rare earth mineral magnets whose supply is monopolized by China. So if China really wants the United States to not have these interceptors, or the Zionist entity not have these interceptors, all they need to do is to make sure that they don't get these magnets. So I think there's a bit of that. This conversation, obviously, again, I'm leaving aside the rents part of it for now. This conversation is also happening in South Korea, in Australia, for instance, to some extent in Japan also, not to that extent, but definitely ASEAN countries, for instance, where the security is provided by the United States, the trade relations are with China, whether it's Singapore, whether it's Indonesia, whether it's Vietnam, and all of that. So I think there was, during their government's tenure, Pakistan came up with its first national security strategy. And that national security strategy, among other things, is about no camp politics. We have our relations with the United States. We have our relations with China. And the US-China rivalry or competition or peer competition, call it what you will, is not going to impact which side Pakistan is going to go, because, and this is something both sides know very clearly. For instance, the 6 land routes that we have opened for Iran, Trump was asked this question yesterday. I mean, we are the mediators. Trump wants to put maximum pressure on Iran, but we have our own interests, and so therefore similarly, the Xi'an-Tehran 15,000 kilometer long railway line is something which is now offsetting some of the pressure of the blockade, the US naval blockade. So there are multiple ways of circumventing this. I'm not sure, because you specifically named the army as having deposits in the United States. I'm not so sure. I'm not privy to those deposits. But yes, there is investment in the United States, but there is also a lot of investment by Pakistan in China, elsewhere in the Middle East. So I don't think that that is something which is going to impact, unless, of course, unless something happens which just completely severs off these interdependencies. Where there is complete friendshoring or reshoring of supply chain. I mean, if you look at the semiconductors, it has the most complex supply chain in the world. So how do you offset that? I don't know. If it happens, then there is also the issue of de-dollarization, which is now, pretty advanced in many ways. So if you're gonna have a system which is outside of SWIFT and the American control, the European control systems, and you have another currency which is yuan or whatever, which the BRICS is talking about, or this particular currency BRICS is calling it something, I forget the name. So if that happens, then you actually have more options rather than less options.
Thank you. We're going to have one last round of comments. Vikram Sohail and Zagam, and then Matu. Vikram.
So thank you. So I just want to start just with, I think it matters how we understand international law and United Nations. I mean, there's an implication in saying Gaza exposed its limits, or that it ended the United Nations, versus saying that it never worked. And I think it matters because I think, like Yahya Sinwar, when the Great March of Return happened in 2018, and Palestinians were slaughtered in front of the world, Sinwar gets up and responds, and he says, look, you see people trying to non-violently walk out, and yet the world responds. This is before Al-Aqsa Flood, right? So his response is in saying, I think Al-Aqsa Flood at one level is exposing the reality of the relationship between force and law. And why that matters is, what does Palestine represent? It's a microcosm of the West Bank and Gaza. That's what's at stake. Law or no law, what really matters is the question of the defense of sovereignty. So the West Bank has a place in the world because there is no sovereignty to defend. Gaza becomes a site of negation when not only is there an expression of sovereignty, but there's an end-to-end sovereign capacity that's demonstrated through the tunnels of Gaza, the ability to reproduce weapons and military capabilities within Gaza. That's a sin that a colonial space or a periphery is not allowed to commit. That's what matters, whether it deploys international law, suspends it, or ends it. And why that matters is in the questions that you're coming to now on regional security, right? Like in thinking about, okay, leaving the UN and coming to regional security, what needs to then be defended, what needs to be reproduced is what Iran has demonstrated in the Strait of Hormuz. So why was Iran able to apply this lever? So they have gone, this defense of sovereignty, they've taken it to a scale we've never witnessed before, at the level of war, because they're not able to dislodge Iran from Hormuz. Why? Because Iran has an end-to-end industrial capability. Like they can replenish, you can strike Iran and they can replenish in real time. And this is something that has altered the security dynamic. And it's interesting we say regional, from China to the Gulf. Like it's interesting to think about that. I think there's something else maybe happening there. But what are the conditions to replicate that sort of end-to-end capability? I have one question in terms of how do you foresee Pakistan's relationship with, say, the reality that Hormuz represents? Because the reality that Hormuz represents is no longer does imperialism of the United States have the lever of the world economy in its hands. That has been the basis of imperialism, controlling capital flows. And I think, so how does Pakistan respond to that? I think getting to the question around, China, US, what I will say on this is, during this war, the US treasuries were no longer a safe haven in the way they historically have been a safe haven. We saw Chinese long-term government vehicle bonds emerging as a safe haven. Now, why does that matter? That matters because, where does, say, capital park itself, right? Is it parking itself in New York, or is it now going to China? So there's like an emerging transformation that'll have domestic implications for Pakistan. Because if there are people with investments in the US, or assuming they can continue, that's not the case. Right? You can't assume that those economic interdependencies are going to hold in the same way. Which poses a question, the second question I wanted to ask around the Belt and Road, or the regional economic question. Right? So the question of Pakistan for sovereign development program around developing like an end-to-end industrial capability that's maybe rooted in the public classes. But how does that attach to the regional economic order as well? So I think maybe those are some of the questions that emerge from me.
Thank you. Professor Gill. Thank you so much for sharing everything that you shared with us. I was curious how the political and military history of Pakistan, which were your primary focal points, relates to the economic history, and in particular, the class formations within Pakistan, as well as the kind of polarization of how the economic forces are then embedded within the world economy. And more specifically, and this I think echoes a little bit what Ali Qadri was asking a moment ago, the role of the military in mediating a lot of economic relations, both as a property owner and as well as a force that is deeply embedded within the economy. And it strikes me that there's something relatively specific about the Pakistan class relations, if you will, given the overwhelming presence of the military. And I'm curious how this ties in with what Vikram was saying, and Ali was also touched on this, and that is how the economic forces relate internationally, not only to the dominant imperialist powers, but as well to the rising multipolar world, and in particular China, so that you could give us a little bit more of the kind of economic standing of Pakistan and also potential for future transformation. Thank you.
Thank you. I just want to pick your brains on the rationality of the national security policy that you described about it being as a non-capitalist, at least for now. But with the regional developments that have happened, especially since after Gaza 2023, we're already into that phase when we are, sort of seeing the alternative security architectures and blocks emerging. And of course, China is an integral part of all of that, that development. So I just want to, sort of pick the brain on the idea that we are already heading towards that kind of tempest loss, especially with the alignments that we are seeing in Turkey, Pakistan, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and China being an integral part of it. So do you think that there will come a moment that we will come out explicitly and say that this is the rational decision that we want to take?
Thank you, Matteo, and then
Very briefly,
of course,
I just wanted to, really pick your brains about, since the discussion moved on the notion of security and the state, and also on the new nationalists that you were talking about, how is the idea of economic security internally developing between the different political forces? As observers of Pakistan, we're seeing security, okay, we're living in a time where we're proud that, we feel safe that we have the nukes, okay, but I wonder on an economic level, how is this being reconciled, the idea of security in that front? Because we know that countries of the Global South have always been, unfortunately, vulnerable to the internal contradictions, and then they were weaponized to undermine the national sovereignty. So how the army seems to have a leverage on to a certain extent, but how is going to reconcile the idea of economic security when it comes to the people in China?
Shan.
Thank you very much for your comments. I just had a question about sort of, so you were talking about this chronology, and it seemed like after Musharraf, we went to the 26th and 27th amendments, which are much more recent history. So my question is there something that happened in that intervening period that would help us understand, what basically why we're taking the positions we are right now, and sort of more you also address on like do we expect that the way that we manage this situation, which I think there's a fairly good consensus here that has been quite commendable, would have played out the same way? Would this have played out the same way under a different army chief, for example? Or, and I mentioned that period with Musharraf and the 26th and 27th amendments because I think that's also when a lot of our tie-ups with China increased, right? The jet deals that helped us win last year's war, the BRI that was mentioned. So I think there's a significant movement in that period that I would be curious to hear your thoughts about. And I think that would also perhaps be determinative or indicative for the question of where we will ultimately side on at least question about China and the US.
Thank you. Of course, we are. So, absolutely.
Yeah, I'm curious in the emerging security order that you're seeing, the regional one, kind of, obviously there's policy we can't talk about, but like what the most recent ongoing war with Iran has demonstrated to these countries in terms of like approaches to security. I mean, you had the conflict recently between you and India as two nuclear powers still having a conventional, war that's happening. Like the conventional weapons are still quite important as part of the escalation ladder or the ability of states to have lower level conflicts and establish deterrent. Iran is fighting two nuclear powers right now with a conventional military, but maybe a questionable nuclear capacity as well, right? Some ambiguity about its nuclear status. Do you see the the NPT regime falling apart? Do you see like all of these powers reaching for the bomb because of the overwhelming and now you have a completely lawless United States, right? I agree that the UN system has never worked well, but now there's a sort of an escalation to discarding it completely and saying, I'm going to destroy your civilization on one day and the next day something else, and it's madness, right? To watch
And you
it
bomb a hospital and you kill 200 kids.
Just slaughter, right? Like not even the appearance.
Right.
So what will that do? Like, what what does the security architecture look like? Does everybody have underground bases, ballistic missile technology, drones, and nuclear weapons? Like, it looks like modern warfare has shifted in since Ukraine in a completely different direction to like the forces that were air power, nuclear weapons, and special forces that the U.S. built its around, and seems to be like irrelevant now, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks for the answers to the earlier questions. I completely agree, and I'd love to talk more about it. But I had a question that I forgot to ask, and was kind of touched on. But I'd like you said that you were going to talk about Pakistan's foreign policy, both of you, but neither of you really focused on China very much. So can you encapsulate how you see Pakistan's relationship with China, and particularly, well, pre-COVID and post-COVID particularly, and then a secondary question that emerged to me afterwards, which is that on the United Nations, I mean, you're saying that the United Nations is defunct, and thank heavens that Pakistan has nuclear weapons, which is a very credible argument. But at the same time, China and a whole lot of other such countries, they have been extolling the virtues of the United Nations, the Charter in particular, and so on. So where do you stand there? How do you see that?
Excellent question. In fact, all the questions with reference to econ and class, they're not in my wheelhouse, so I can't respond to those. But the question that I can respond to very quickly, you're conflating the camp politics, which is essentially peer competition, China and the US, with minilateral and issue-based coalitions. Those will happen. As a matter of fact, they're part of the rise of middle powers. And those middle powers of the global south also, and the developed middle powers also, which were basking in the glory of the United States. And since the arrival on the scene of Trump, as Kani said, it was a glorious lie, or whatever term he used. So no more of that signboard, Václav Havel's signboard. So they've also suddenly realized that they don't really have the military power. Right now in Europe, for instance, there are only two experienced militaries, Russian and Ukrainian. Everyone else in Europe, when it comes to military prowess, they don't stand a chance. I mean, whether it's UK, whether it's, France, anyway, that's a separate debate. So minilaterals and issue-based coalitions will happen. With reference to the changing conduct of war, because the nature of war never changes, but the conduct of war keeps changing. The US concept since the revolution in military affairs was wedded to shock and awe and precision. You have, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, satellite, you have eyes everywhere. And what we've seen is that with these new technologies, the US ground forces, whether special operation forces, whether infantry and armor or whatever, will never be committed on the ground unless the commanders had complete situational awareness. That has been the standard operational model of the US military. What has happened is, and so therefore you have these systems and platforms that are very precise, but also extremely expensive. One theater high altitude area defense interceptor costs $4 million, right? And over 40 years, the United States has managed to have a stockpile of 10,000 of them. Now, compare that with the Iranians producing Shahid 136 drones, 1,000 of them in a month, right? We have seen this in Ukraine also. We have seen, as a matter of fact, I do a policy program, and I had a couple of these experts from the United States, scholars, policy experts, do work on nuclear weapons. And so this new trend of entanglement of nuclear and conventional forces. For instance, if you are using conventional munitions to destroy and degrade the communication infrastructure of a nuclear power, would that be considered an attack which needs to be responded with nuclear weapons? Right? Let me give you another example. So the Ukrainians have been using these sea drones, and they forced the Russian Black Sea Fleet to just be in a corner. So if you use a sea drone to actually, destroy or partially damage a nuclear submarine which has nuclear ballistic missiles, would the nuclear power consider that an act which has to be responded with by using nuclear weapons? So there is this entanglement, which is, and then you add AI to that, and it becomes extremely complex. So what you have is a lateral diffusion of technology, where, for instance, the Ukrainian operation deep inside Russian territory, in which FPV drones being used by operators through fiber optic cables, destroying the delivery systems, the strategic bombers of Russia. These are bombers that carry nuclear weapons, right? These are things that have happened, which scholars are now working on to try to figure out how to respond to this. So the Iranian strategy of blocking Hormuz is something which the Iranians have been saying, for Christ's sake, for the last God knows how many years. One of the CENTCOM chiefs was brought on CNN, and the anchor asked him, said, "Well, did you have plans to respond to this?" He said, "This is the first thing that we kept talking about. So how come Trumpy didn't know about it? Or, for Pete's sake, Pete Hexet didn't know about it." So something is amiss there. But the Iranians have been. I had Mohammad Marandi on my program in 2019, and I asked him this question. That program is a matter of record. I asked him, I said, "Listen, if there is an attack on Iran, what would would you escalate horizontally?" He said, "Yes." And he mentioned UAE very clearly. He said, "We'll raise them to the ground." So all of this was known. It's not like it happened suddenly. And so you now have the conduct of asymmetric war. I mean, war is essentially about creating your asymmetry over your adversary. That's the most important. And so Iran was not fighting the US war. Iran was fighting its own war against the US and the Zionist entity. This is a completely different kind of war. It's supposed to raise the cost of it. And the Pentagon controller on Wednesday's briefing said $25 billion cost. Lawmakers are saying it's upwards of $600 billion. So yes, we are aware of that, and we are watching this very closely. There is a particular cell within the military whose entire function is to look at what's going on and then to apply the lessons of that. Of course, we don't have a Hormuz, so obviously we can't apply the lessons of Hormuz to Pakistan. Iran also has this amazing geography or topography. Look at the shorelines, Caspian, right, and then the Gulf, and then down. It doesn't. How many cosmopolitan cities does it have along the shoreline? Not one. You have Bandar Anzali up north, you have Bandar Abbas, and you have Chabahar. Because the geography of the Gulf on the eastern side is completely different from the geography of the Gulf on the western side. So, and Iran has the great advantage of luring the enemy in and then killing it. We don't have that advantage. This city that we are sitting in is smack on the border. We cannot allow India to come in and then finish him off. So our strategy has been to take the war to India, not allow India to come in. So geography is tyrannical. So you have to apply your strategies on the basis of geography.
Thank you.
Sorry, I'll just add in a little bit if I can. I think the key question, one of the key questions is in the new world order, China and USA, and then Pakistan's relationship between the two. Before we start, there's a little historical fact and a little traditional fact that I'd like to give. In Pakistan, we have a concept of a chaudhry. Chaudhry in a village, chaudhry is the person that everybody comes to because, he's the big guy and everybody, any problem, they come in. He's the court, he's the authority, he's the executive, he's everything. And the concept in Pakistan is that there can't be one chaudhry in a village because then he becomes a dictator. So there has to be two chaudhrys always. And the best kind of family is that has a relationship with both chaudhrys. So now coming to the historical fact, in the 1950s and then the 60s especially, China was just a closed place. And Pakistan was the only country that actually opened up its relationship with China. And there was a time when China, if you were a foreigner in China, they thought that you were a Pakistani. The rest of the world was Pakistan. And that relationship developed. So when in Ayub's time, America wanted to have a relationship with China, some people told him that, look, why should we facilitate that? Let them fight. Why should we become the conduit for a relationship? And somebody gave the example of these two chaudhrys. Said one day these two chaudhrys will be there, and if we are the first ones to build up the relationship, we can have a continuous relationship with both. Over the years, that relationship with USA has gone up and down. And with China, it has become even more rock solid. So, first of all, I've been going to China often. And I've been meeting their top officials because of my role as the parliamentary leader in the Senate of one of the largest political parties in the country. And so I've been having a lot of talks and discussions. And that has been going on even before that. So I've had a 15, 20 years relationship with them. And I've seen one thing that has changed. Generally, Chinese were they don't, as a government, they don't, and even maybe culturally, they don't let out their emotions too much. They'll wait for the time, even if they're angry, they'll wait for the time to talk and to discuss. And that's what I always used to find. We used to talk to them about various things. We used to get, like a typical Pakistani, pretty emotional about things. But the answer was always, be an old wood. Be an old wood. This time, when the tariff was imposed by Trump, I happened to be there the day after the tariff was announced. And this is the first time I saw them aggressive. And this was not one city. This was not one area. Different cities in China that I visited, every time our first meeting was, this is war. This is an economic war. We are going to fight back. So I kept asking them, I said, Excellencies, this is not the typical reaction I've been seeing. You're old wood. Why this sudden reaction? They said, we have now reached a point where we wanted to reach in terms of our economic power. Now we don't feel that the US is going to be a danger for us. So I don't think that there's going to be a major conflict between China and USA of the kind that you asked. But if on a theoretical basis, if as a hypothesis, if it ever was to come a time where we had to decide, then you have to realize that the relationship between the people of Pakistan and at least the people of China is so strong that we will never be in the camp of USA if it comes to that hypothesis. So,
That's quite good to hear. It's in the but I mean, judging by because every position has we can experiment, we can do for experiments in the past, and also probably the alliance between the peoples of Pakistan and the peoples of Gaza, Palestinians as well, is also just as strong, and Pakistan and many other Muslim nations, irrespective of the fact that they shed they showed some emotions to that effect, but the financial restraints and also the ideological restraints, the ideological dominance of ideas like Oxford is a good school or MSc is a good school, while they are weapons, in fact, and if we think about them, the knowledge that they produce the conditions of the planet, because this is the dominant ideology, and the conditions of the planet are quite varying, to say the least, if the planet survives. So these are institutions. So we have a dominance of finance and a dominance of ideas that are actually they hold us. They hold states like Pakistan and other states that have. I mean, our relationship with Pakistan is, I am Qadiri Gilani, so I come from South Africa.
yes,
So our relationship, I'm a cousin of probably many of
the people here,
people
yes,
here.
yes.
And and yet we have not seen, in the Muslim world, it's not just Pakistan, why we had a genocide on display because of that dominance, these fake ideas that Oxford is a good school, not a gun against people, that finance is not meant to basically degrade the nation, popularize and make nuclear weapons an enemy of the people rather than a friend of the people, like North Korea. And that is what we have today. We are in a position, we must root our analysis in class analysis, and we must shed these fake notions of knowledge from the West. That is why, our alliance with China is
True.
I thought somebody.
A CIA agent.
About that, yes.
One last thing I wanted to say on this is that yes, I agree with you that what we are seeing now, we are going to see every country wanting to have a nuclear deterrent. And the reason is that without that, you can be just killed. So that is going to be the new, that I foresee for sure. And lastly, yes, I don't remember who raised this, but the issue was regarding every country needs their own, equipments and their own industries to flourish. I was speaking to the Iranian speaker who came to recently, just before the war. He came on a conference to Pakistan. And I was speaking to him and I said, I think they knew that something was going to happen. So I said, I asked a question on this table, he was speaking, I was one of the people who was listening and taking notes. So I asked him, I said, what is the, in case you're attacked, what will happen? How will you manage? And he said, have you seen a candy factory? So I looked at him, I said, I'm talking about war and he's talking about candy factories. I said, no, I haven't. He said when you make candies, there is a whole, there's a trail. So the one machine makes the candy, another one puts something else on it, the third one wraps it, and they keep flowing into the supermarkets. He said, missiles, that's the way we make our missiles. And so let them come, we've got enough. So that's, that is something that we actually saw.
On that note, Ammar, thank you all for coming to the Thought and Action Forum.